On the morning of the 9th of November, 1841, Governor Francis Cockburn of the Bahamas opened a letter that would rattle the foundations of international politics. Written in uneven strokes of trembling ink, it described the arrival of an American brig at Nassau Harbor, its deck soaked in blood, its crew crippled or dead, and more than 100 enslaved men and women who had wrested their freedom with violence. To the British governor, it was a diplomatic nightmare. To American slaveholders, it was a catastrophe. To abolitionists, it was proof that resistance could succeed. And to the rebels themselves, it was the culmination of desperation transformed into ferocity. This was the Creole Revolt, the most successful slave uprising in American maritime history. To understand how this ship became a crucible of freedom and terror, we must sail back to the 25th of October, 1841, when the Creole left Richmond, Virginia. At first glance, she looked like any other vessel in America's booming coastal trade, 187 tons, under the command of Captain Robert Ensor, loaded with tobacco and supplies. But below deck was the real cargo, 135 human beings crammed in the suffocating hold, shackled, divided, and treated as merchandise. Their destination, the slave markets of New Orleans. The America of 1841 was a nation teetering between prosperity and ruin. Only 26 stars adorned the flag, representing a union of 17 million people, 2 million of them enslaved. The country was still reeling from the panic of 1837, an economic collapse that bankrupted states and shattered banks. In Springfield, Illinois, a lanky lawyer named Abraham Lincoln spent his days chasing debt cases, while in Virginia, fortunes were rebuilt not with banking stability, but with human cargo, sold southward to feed the insatiable hunger of cotton and sugar plantations. The men and women aboard the Creole were not strangers to this system. Of the 135, 103 had been confined in slave prisons in Richmond. Another 32 were purchased at Hampton Roads for this voyage alone. Most were owned by Johnson and Epperson, investors who saw in their bodies nothing but profit margins. Yet 26 souls belonged to one man traveling as a passenger, Thomas Macargo, a seasoned trader. He strutted aboard with the arrogance of someone who had turned lives into ledger lines too many times to count. Alongside him was John R. Huell, another trader known for his cruelty. Stories of his punishments whispered among captives like ghost tales. But hidden in this cargo was a man who carried a dangerous spark. Madison Washington, 25 years old. Years before, he had escaped bondage, fleeing across the border to Canada where he tasted freedom's sweet air. But love drew him back. He returned to Virginia, seeking his wife, only to be recaptured. Now he was forced aboard the Creole, shackled once more, but carrying within him both the memory of liberty and the knowledge of what it would take to reclaim it. Unlike many aboard, Washington had walked free soil. He knew the difference, and that knowledge was a weapon sharper than any blade. To the white South, he was a nightmare embodied. Ever since Nat Turner's bloody revolt in 1831, where 57 whites were killed before Turner was captured and executed, slaveholders lived in fear that their property might turn on them. In Jamaica, Sam Sharp's rebellion of 1831-1832 had shaken the British Empire itself, with 60,000 enslaved people rising in defiance. Though Sharp was hanged, Britain abolished slavery in its colonies just 2 years later. The echoes of those uprisings thundered in the minds of Southern planters. They knew rebellion was contagious, and the Creole was tinder waiting for a spark. This was not a transatlantic slaver, but something in some ways worse, a ship in the American coastal trade. After Congress banned the international importation of slaves in 1808, demand had not disappeared, it had intensified. Instead of ships from Africa, enslaved people were marched or shipped from the Upper South to the booming plantations of the Deep South. Between 1808 and 1864, more than 50,000 men, women, and children were legally moved along the coast, numbers eerily matched by the 51,000 Africans smuggled in illegally during the same period. New Orleans, the terminus for ships like the Creole, became the beating heart of this commerce in human misery. It grew into America's third largest city, its prosperity drenched in the sweat and blood of the enslaved. Life on the Creole was regimented and dehumanizing. During daylight, captives were allowed brief moments on deck, eyes stinging from sun and salt. At night, they were herded back into the hold, separated by gender and walled in with tobacco boxes. Men chained forward, 57 women confined aft. The dragging of iron across wooden planks became the soundtrack of their voyage, an unending metallic reminder of captivity. The air below reeked of sweat, vomit, and despair. Yet amid this, Madison Washington stood apart. His sharp intelligence and physical presence drew notice, even from the crew. Soon he was named head cook for the enslaved, a position that granted him mobility, access to supplies, and, crucially, moments to whisper with others. He would not stand alone. 3 others emerged as co-conspirators. Elijah Morris, only 21, but hardened by loss. Doc Ruffin, whose knowledge of medicine would prove chillingly useful, and Ben Blacksmith, whose grasp of maritime rumors and precedents gave their dreams shape. Blacksmith had heard stories that were passed along in slave whispers and encoded in work songs. Ships like the Comet in 1830, the Encomium in 1833, the Enterprise in 1835, and the Hermosa in 1840, all American vessels that had ended up in British Caribbean ports. And in every case, the enslaved were set free under British law. These were not just rumors. They were proof of possibility. So, in the choking darkness of the hold, while others tried to sleep amid the nauseating sway of the ship, the 4 men spoke in hushed tones. Their words were fragments of hope wrapped in danger, about storms when guards grew lax, about tools that could become weapons, about allies who might risk everything for a chance at liberty. Above them, Captain Ensor slept beside his wife, his 4-year-old daughter, and his teenage niece, an irony that made the ship more vulnerable but also made the stakes infinitely higher. The crew numbered only 10. 1 firearm worked reliably, and the ocean stretched endless in every direction. The odds seemed impossible, but so did the thought of remaining property. As the Creole rolled across the Atlantic, chains rattling with each wave, something else moved unseen, a storm in the hearts of men and women who had nothing left to lose. And Madison Washington, once free and now caged again, began to prepare for a night that would stain the deck with blood and send shockwaves across nations. The Creole drifted steadily southward, carried by trade winds toward New Orleans, but in its belly something more dangerous than tobacco was fermenting. In the dark recesses of the hold, words passed softly from lip to lip, seeds of rebellion sprouting in whispers. Madison Washington, the man who had once tasted Canada's cold air of liberty, had been placed in a position that gave him unusual reach. As cook for the enslaved, he moved between compartments, passing out meager rations of salted meat, hardtack, and beans. But with each ladle of stew, he served something more potent: words of encouragement, fragments of strategy, slivers of hope. Washington was not alone. Elijah Morris, barely past boyhood, carried in his chest a rage born of loss. Torn from family in Virginia, he lived each day with the memory of separation. His fury needed direction, and Madison offered it. Then there was Doc Ruffin, a man whose knowledge of anatomy had been gained in grim fashion, perhaps apprenticing under physicians who treated the enslaved like livestock. Ruffin understood where a knife might cut to disable rather than kill, where a blow could silence with precision. And Ben Blacksmith, aptly named, had worked iron long enough to see tools in every bar, every chain, every shard of metal scattered across the ship. He also carried stories about ships that had once stumbled into British ports and disgorged their human cargo into freedom. The 4 formed a nucleus of defiance. At night, while others drifted into uneasy slumber, their whispers threaded through the fetid air. They studied patterns, the footsteps of guards during shift changes, the moments when crews slipped into drunken complacency, the way storms drove sailors below deck and left the enslaved unguarded. They noticed where lanterns cast shadows, where darkness pooled thick enough to hide movement. Even the sea itself became part of their plan. Rough waters sickened both captives and crew, reducing vigilance, creating windows of vulnerability. Washington's role as cook was a gift of fate. It allowed him to linger near storerooms and kitchens, where knives and iron bars lay within reach. He began to slip small objects into hidden crevices, improvised weapons stashed behind crates, tucked beneath planks, passed hand to hand in moments too brief for overseers to notice. The sound of chains dragging across the deck masked the quiet clink of metal being hidden away. The conspirators drew strength not only from their observations but from history itself. They spoke often of the Amistad, the Spanish schooner seized by Sengbe Pierre, known in America as Cinque, and his companions in 1839. Their revolt had seized the imagination of enslaved communities across the Americas. If Africans could rise and take control of a ship, then why not men from Virginia and Maryland? The news of Cinque's defiance had filtered southward through whispered networks that planters underestimated, but which enslaved people had refined into a lifeline of knowledge. Precedent was power. The comet of 1830, driven by storms into Bermuda, had its captives freed by British authorities. The encomium in 1833 met the same fate. In 1835, the Enterprise limped into Bermuda with 78 enslaved people aboard. All were freed. And only the year before the Creole sailed, the Hermosa ran aground in the Bahamas. 38 souls stepped into liberty. These cases weren't distant rumors. They were proof that British soil, even on small islands, was transformed into a sanctuary by the force of law. To the enslaved aboard the Creole, they were roadmaps. Washington and his allies chose their companions carefully. Not everyone could be trusted. Fear had long been the most effective chain, and many captives, worn down by loss and exhaustion, might betray a plot simply to avoid punishment. So Madison spoke sparingly, identifying men whose eyes burned with something beyond resignation. His words were measured. Do you want to die a slave, or risk everything for a chance at freedom? For those who answered with fire, he revealed more. The geography of the hold itself became part of the plan. The men and women were divided, 57 women forced aft, the men penned in the bow. Tobacco crates served as walls, a cruel architecture that kept husbands from wives, fathers from daughters. But that same architecture created blind spots, shadows where conspirators could gather unseen, where tools could be passed hand to hand without notice. Even despair had its uses. Guards accustomed to the sight of slumped, silent bodies failed to notice when whispers carried across the darkness. Above, the crew lived in arrogant complacency. Captain Ensor believed 10 white sailors and a handful of pistols could manage 135 chained captives. His gravest mistake was not merely his negligence but his hubris. He had brought his wife, his 4-year-old daughter, and his teenage niece aboard, as though the presence of his family would soften the cruelty of his trade. Instead, it would expose the ship's vulnerabilities in ways he could never foresee. And then there were the slave traders, like Thomas McCargo and John R. Huell. Their reputations preceded them. McCargo fancied himself an expert in managing human cargo, wielding cruelty as a tool of profit. Huell was worse. His knife was not just an implement of discipline but of sadistic pleasure. The captives knew their names, their habits, their tempers. They hated them with a clarity sharper than steel. In the suffocating dark, a hierarchy of rebellion took shape. Madison Washington was its center, a man of experience and resolve. Elijah Morris was fury incarnate, the young blade eager to strike. Doc Ruffin was calculation, cold and clinical. Ben Blacksmith was memory and prophecy, the keeper of stories that proved the impossible was possible. Together, they became something more than men in chains. They became the architects of an uprising. The Creole rolled forward through the Atlantic, the crew oblivious to the storm building below deck. Every clatter of chains, every whisper in the dark, every furtive glance was a stitch in a net that would soon ensnare them. The men who were counted on paper as cargo were becoming something far more dangerous, conspirators with a plan, driven not by fantasy but by memory and precedent. In their minds, one truth echoed louder than the sea: freedom was not given, it had to be taken. And when the moment came, when the crew was at its weakest and the night at its darkest, they would strike with a fury that would turn the Creole from a slave ship into something the world had never seen before, a floating battlefield where chains would shatter and history itself would bend. The days crept forward with an almost unbearable slowness. Each sunrise brought the same routines: chains rattled, rations served, guards yawning in boredom. But in the minds of the conspirators, the voyage had become a ticking clock. They knew they had only one chance, one moment when chaos and courage would collide. That moment arrived on the storm-tossed night of the 7th of November. By evening, the Creole was 200 miles northeast of Miami. The sea was rough, its swells hurling the ship from side to side, drenching the deck with spray. Seasickness gripped many of the captives, and even some crew moved sluggishly, drained by nausea. Lanterns flickered in the salt wind, and only one hung lit near the bow. Shadows devoured the rest of the deck. For Madison, Washington, it was the perfect cover. Around 9 o'clock, the ship's routine shifted. The first watch ended. The second began. For a few minutes, patrols thinned. It was a fragile seam in the fabric of vigilance, but Washington had studied it with a predator's eye. He emerged silently from the women's hold where he had hidden, his broad frame blending into the dark. Behind him, 18 men followed, each moving with the deadly calm of someone who has chosen to risk everything. In their hands gleamed knives, iron bars, and makeshift clubs pulled from hidden caches. The first to sense something amiss was Zephaniah Gifford, the first mate. He was checking moorings near the bow when he glimpsed figures moving where no slave should be. He opened his mouth to shout, but the warning never came. A heavy bar swung from the dark, smashing his skull with a sickening crack. The echo rang across the wet planks, announcing to the night that the storm had broken inside the Creole. At midship, John R. Huell sat smoking a cigar, a man counting profits in his head, imagining the New Orleans auction block. His arrogance blinded him. Madison, Washington stepped from the shadows, kitchen knife in hand. Huell fumbled for his pistol, but his fingers trembled. The shot he fired went wide, the bullet hissing uselessly into the sea. Washington's blade found his throat, slashing deep, severing the artery. Blood poured across the deck, hot and steaming in the cold wind. Huell collapsed, his cigar rolling from his lips, its ember dying in the spreading pool. The scream tore through the night, rousing crew and captives alike. Chaos exploded. The rebels surged like a tide, each targeting a man marked during days of observation. They were not fighting blindly. They struck with precision. Ruffin, the grim physician of their cause, attacked with surgical cruelty, disabling blows that left men writhing but alive long enough to witness their defeat. Elijah Morris, young and furious, met Captain Robert Ensor as he stumbled from his cabin. Ensor's eyes went wide at the sight of armed captives, eyes burning with vengeance. He reached for his weapon, but Morris was faster. The young man's knife plunged into the captain's abdomen, tearing muscle and viscera. Ensor collapsed, clutching at the hot blood spilling between his fingers. He would survive, but his days as a commander ended on that deck. In the aft, Ben Blacksmith rushed to guard the women. He knew desperate sailors might try to use them as shields. The sound of chains breaking filled the hold. Iron links struck with hammers, pried open by force. Screams of fear mingled with sobs of relief as the women realized the uprising had begun. Above, crew scrambled up the rigging like rats, fleeing higher and higher, terrified of the blades flashing below. One man fell, a captive struck by a stray bullet fired in blind panic. He collapsed into Ruffin's arms, blood soaking his chest. With trembling hands, Ruffin tried to staunch the flow, but the wound was mortal. The dying man whispered a final thought of family left behind in Virginia before his body went still. His death was the first cost of freedom that night. Meanwhile, William Merritt, the plantation supervisor, tried to vanish among tobacco crates, but Madison found him. Dragging him into the lantern's glow, Washington pressed a blade to his throat. "You will navigate us to the Bahamas," he hissed, voice like steel, "or you will join your friend Huell in the ocean." Merritt's pale face told the crew everything. They were beaten. Inside their cabin, Ensor's wife and children huddled, trembling as the battle raged outside. The shrieks of the wounded, the groans of men struck down, the scrape of weapons on flesh and bone. It was a symphony of terror that would scar their memories forever. The little girl wailed inconsolably, muffling her face in her mother's skirts, while the niece tried in vain to quiet her sobs. For them, the night was not a fight for freedom, but a nightmare they could neither flee nor forget. By midnight, the deck was a slaughterhouse. Huell lay dead, Gifford mortally wounded, Ensor bleeding, sailors clinging to rigging, too afraid to descend. The rebels stood blood-stained but victorious. Madison, Washington walked the planks like a general surveying his field, eyes searching for any lingering threat. In that moment, he was no longer property. He was master of the Creole. The defeated sailors were ordered down from the masts. Washington promised survival if they cooperated, and the promise was believed because the alternative gleamed in every rebel's weapon. Chains were smashed, one after another, their clinks ringing like a chorus of liberation. Cargo manifests were found in the captain's cabin lists of human beings as property, with values written beside each name. Washington tore the papers to shreds, scattering them like ashes into the sea. The act was symbolic but seismic. In that gesture, they ceased to be cargo and became free. The body of John Huell was dragged to the ship's side. Madison stared down at the man who had inflicted so much pain, his face set with grim satisfaction. "Let the fish feed on your flesh," he muttered, before pushing the corpse into the dark waters below. Waves swallowed it without ceremony. As the night grew quiet again, only the groans of the wounded remained, mingling with the endless rhythm of the sea. The Creole, once a vessel of commerce and misery, had been transformed in blood into something unthinkable, a ship of rebels. Its helm seized, its cargo freed, its destiny uncertain. Madison Washington stood on deck, wind whipping at his face, and felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. He had led men into violence and emerged victorious, but he knew this was only the beginning. Ahead lay waters patrolled by empires, courts waiting with laws, and the unknown fate of freedom on foreign shores. For tonight, however, the Creole sailed under new command, its chains broken, its deck baptized in blood. Dawn broke over the Atlantic with a deceptive calm. The sea had settled, its waves now rolling with steady rhythm, as if mocking the chaos that had erupted hours earlier. The deck of the Creole was still stained with blood, the smell of iron sharp in the salt air. For the first time in their lives, 135 men, women, and children stood unshackled, their wrists raw but free. The enslaved had become the masters of the ship. Yet liberation brought not relief, but responsibility. Madison Washington, tall and resolute, moved like a commander. He knew their rebellion was not finished, it had only begun. Freedom won, in a storm of blades, could vanish with the arrival of a single British or American warship. Order was needed, and quickly. He divided the men into squads, forming an armed guard of 18, the same who had led the revolt. They rotated in shifts, keeping constant watch on the surviving crew. Every rope, every hatch, every sail was monitored. Washington's voice carried authority now. When he spoke, even hardened sailors obeyed. The crew had been beaten, but not killed. Some huddled at the stern, bandaged and pale, others forced into menial tasks under the watch of armed captives. William Merritt, the plantation supervisor who once wielded power over black bodies, now trembled as he held navigational tools, guiding a voyage that might save or doom them all. Washington had forced him to swear on the Bible that he would steer them toward the Bahamas, British territory, where slavery had been abolished 8 years earlier. It was a calculated mercy. To kill Merritt would be justice. To spare him was strategy. Life on the Creole shifted into a strange new rhythm. Chains were dragged on deck and smashed open, iron links clattering into heaps. For the first time, the women emerged unbound, some shielding their children from the carnage, others staring in stunned silence at the sea. Many could not believe it. They had gone to sleep, enslaved, and woken into a world where their captors cowered. Some wept openly, their cries mingling with the gulls overhead. Food, once hoarded by officers, was redistributed. Elijah Morris took charge of rations. The captives ate fresh bread, salted beef, even fruit and rum found in the officers' stores, luxuries they had never tasted in bondage. The irony was bitter. For weeks they had survived on scraps while their captors feasted. Now the roles had reversed. The women organized themselves under the guidance of Ben Blacksmith. Some cooked, some tended to children, and others performed the grisly work of cleaning the deck. Blood had soaked deep into the planks, and the stench was unbearable. As they scrubbed, they sang soft African melodies carried from plantations, songs once forbidden under the lash. Their voices rose over the Atlantic, a mournful hymn transformed into an anthem of survival. Each stain they wiped away was not just blood, but history itself being rewritten. Then came the discovery that chilled even the rebels. Instruments of torture hidden in compartments below, whips with metal tips, shackles designed to cut into flesh. muzzles that locked into the mouths of women and children to prevent them from speaking. When Madison ordered these dragged onto deck, the liberated gathered silently, eyes fixed on the grotesque tools. One woman collapsed into tears, confessing she had once been forced to wear a muzzle for teaching children to read. Washington lifted the device high, then hurled it into the sea. One by one, every instrument followed, swallowed by the waves. The splashes rang like baptisms, each one a burial for the cruelty of their captors. Doc Ruffin assumed the role of ship's doctor. His skills, once used reluctantly under masters, now served his people. He tended to wounds inflicted during the uprising and examined scars of long suffering. He noted broken bones that had healed poorly, whip marks crisscrossing backs, malnutrition etched into thin faces. His work became more than treatment, it was documentation, evidence of the system they had overthrown. In his eyes, each scar was testimony, each healed wound a chapter in a ledger of horror. Children, too young to understand, played on the deck where carnage had unfolded the night before. Their laughter mixed with the groans of wounded sailors, a cruel juxtaposition that underscored how trauma and innocence could coexist in fragile balance. Some children clutched their mothers tightly, refusing to leave their sides, eyes wide with memories of screams and blood. For 2 days, the Creole sailed like a phantom ship. Madison patrolled constantly, inspecting sails, consulting merit on bearings, ensuring guards stayed vigilant. His presence was both shield and spear, a reminder that the revolt had succeeded because of discipline, and that discipline must continue if freedom were to last. He had won a battle, but he knew the war was not over. Ahead lay the Bahamas, where British law promised liberty. But law could be bent, and nations could be swayed. Each evening, when the sun sank into the sea and the ship glowed red in its dying light, Madison gathered the people. He spoke of the road still ahead, of the dangers that waited, of the chance for betrayal or capture. He told them they must stand united, for divided they would fall back into chains. His words were not fiery but steady, the voice of a man who had seen freedom and refused to lose it again. And as stars spread across the Atlantic sky, the freed men and women of the Creole lay down not as cargo, not as property, but as human beings steering their own fate. Yet beneath the calm sea, unseen currents twisted. Freedom was close, but so too was the reach of empires. The real test had not yet begun. The third dawn after the revolt arrived with a silence heavy as judgment. The Creole drifted across calm waters, sails patched and strained, its timbers groaning like a wounded beast. Yet the air aboard was charged not with despair, but with the feverish anticipation of land. The Bahamas lay ahead, a string of British islands shimmering like a promise. For the captives, now turned rebels, it was more than geography. It was the line between slavery and freedom, between survival and annihilation. Originally, Madison Washington had dreamed of sailing to Liberia. That West African colony, founded by freedmen and supported by the American Colonization Society, stood in the minds of many as a beacon of black independence. But Merritt, their captive navigator, crushed that hope with cold logic. The voyage was too long, the supplies too few, the seas too dangerous. Liberia might have been the motherland, but the Bahamas closer, British, abolitionist, was the only real chance. The irony was bitter. A voyage designed to deliver bodies to New Orleans would now deliver them to the very empire America's slaveholders feared most. Britain had outlawed slavery in 1833 and completed emancipation by 1838, a decision that had reshaped the Caribbean. The Bahamas became a haven where recaptured Africans, men and women freed from intercepted slave ships, lived in distinct communities, their languages, customs, and faiths intact. Yoruba, Mandingo, Igbo, Congo names whispered among the freed on Nassau's streets. To step onto Bahamian soil was to step into a society where black men not only walked free but even served as soldiers in the British Army. The mere thought electrified the Creole's deck. Some captives wept as the horizon drew nearer, hands clasped in prayer. Others whispered of family members still enslaved in Virginia or Maryland, wondering if freedom here would forever sever them from those they loved. For many, the approach of land was a miracle tangled with grief. Madison Washington paced the planks, his mind heavy with questions. Would the British honor their law and free them, Or would politics intervene, returning them to American chains? He had no illusions. Governments bowed to power, and America's slave-holding South was loud and relentless. Still, hope was stronger than fear. He carried himself with the calm authority of a man who knew hesitation was fatal. To the others, he became not just a leader but a symbol, the embodiment of a truth they scarcely dared to believe. Freedom could be seized. On the morning of the 9th of November, as mist curled above the sea, shouts erupted from the masthead. Land, green shapes emerged from fog, rising like ghosts from the ocean, the first outline of the Bahamian Islands. Hearts pounded, throats tightened, men gripped the railings with white-knuckled fists. Mothers held their children closer, whispering promises they themselves barely believed. As the Creole neared the harbor at Nassau, small boats began to dot the water, approaching in cautious arcs. At their helms were black Bahamians, many of them descendants of freed Africans. They shouted words of encouragement across the waves, their voices carrying like a chorus of deliverance. Some waved oars, others lifted machetes skyward in salute. To the weary rebels on deck, it felt like a reception prepared by history itself. The harbor pilot boarded next, Samuel Johnson, a black Bahamian and former slave who had gained his freedom with abolition. He stepped onto the blood-stained deck and froze. His eyes darted over the bodies, the torn chains, the faces of men and women who now stood upright as equals. For a long moment, he said nothing, only taking in the scene. Then, in a voice choked with emotion, he whispered, "My brothers, you are in free waters now." Those words washed over the ship like a tide. Some captives collapsed in sobs, others raised trembling hands toward the sky. Madison studied Johnson's face, searching for signs of betrayal, but saw only recognition and solidarity. In that instant, the rebels felt for the first time that their bloody gamble might truly have carried them to freedom. But not everyone rejoiced. In the captain's cabin, Ensaw's wife and children wept, terrified of what awaited them ashore. Would they be prisoners? Would they be abandoned? The women among the captives, too, eyed the horizon with a mixture of longing and dread. They knew law could be fickle, and even British law might bow to diplomacy. As the Creole slipped deeper into Nassau's harbor, the drama that had begun in Virginia now entered a new arena, no longer a struggle of chains and blades, but of courts, politics, and nations. The question loomed: would Britain defend the law of freedom, or bend before America's demands? For now, all the freed could do was watch the green Bahamian shores grow nearer, hearts pounding in time with the surf, waiting to discover if liberty awaited them on land or if the ocean had carried them only from one prison to another. The Creole glided into Nassau harbor under a dense curtain of fog, its decks scarred with blood and its sails fluttering in the faint morning breeze. To onlookers, it must have seemed like a ghost ship, an American brig arriving battered, silent, and carrying an unspoken storm within its hold. But the silence did not last. As soon as word spread through Nassau, the harbor erupted with a spectacle that no one present would forget. Hundreds of small boats rushed toward the anchored vessel, their rowers mostly black Bahamians. Many were descendants of Africans liberated after the British abolition of the slave trade. Some, the very men who had once been recaptives, pulled from intercepted slave ships. They carried machetes, harpoons, sticks, improvised weapons raised, not in threat but in solidarity. From their boats came cries in English, in African dialects, in voices sharpened by memory. "You are free. Come ashore. They cannot take you back." The sight of those boats circling the Creole was electrifying. To the former captives standing on deck, it was as if the ocean itself had delivered an army of kin. A bond of recognition passed across the waves, slaves freed by revolt, meeting slaves freed by law. For the sailors cowering at the stern, it was terrifying. They realized that they were surrounded not only by their former cargo, but also by a free black population eager to protect them. News traveled quickly to the American consulate. John Bacon, the consul in Nassau, reacted with fury. He dashed off an urgent letter to Governor Francis Cockburn demanding the immediate arrest of the rebels and the return of all captives to their rightful owners. Bacon painted the revolt in lurid tones, calling the freedmen murderers and the uprising an atrocity against innocent men. His demands were simple: imprison the leaders, restore the ship to American control, and return the enslaved to their chains. But Governor Cockburn faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of empire and law. British policy since 1833 was clear. Any enslaved person setting foot on British soil was free. To violate that law would be to betray not only Parliament, but the moral high ground Britain claimed in its abolitionist stance. At the same time, he knew the United States was watching, its southern planters howling for vengeance. The wrong move could ignite a diplomatic inferno, perhaps even war. As debate raged in government offices, the harbour itself became a theatre of tension. Soldiers of the 2nd West India Regiment boarded the Creole. They were black men in red British uniforms, many of them former slaves who had earned freedom through service. For the rebels on deck, the sight was surreal. Armed black soldiers arriving not as jailers but as protectors. Yet the lieutenant leading them, a white officer, stood stiff, wary of the men's fraternization. Later, the American consul would bitterly complain that the soldiers treated the freed captives as brothers, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement instead of restraining them. British magistrates inspected the ship, and what they found only deepened the scandal. Below deck, they uncovered unrecorded deaths. At least 3 captives had perished before the revolt, their bodies dumped overboard without entry in the ship's log. Shackles, muzzles, and whips were discovered, evidence of systematic brutality. Women came forward, their voices steady despite trembling hands, to testify to years of abuse. One named Sarah recounted repeated rapes at the hands of trader Thomas McCargo. Others spoke of children torn away, of punishments designed not to discipline but to humiliate. Each word was a dagger, piercing the American facade of property management to expose the truth. Slavery was not a system of labor but a machinery of cruelty. McCargo himself lay wounded, his arm mangled in the uprising. British officials interrogated him in delirium. His half-muttered confessions of beatings ordered, women violated, men broken, only confirmed what the survivors had claimed. For the rebels, watching their tormentor reduced to a trembling wreck was a grim satisfaction. Madison Washington, when asked by a British officer why they had rebelled, answered plainly, "We chose death before slavery, freedom, or nothing." Meanwhile, Consul Bacon scrambled to raise a force of American sailors in port to retake the Creole by violence. He promised cash, appealed to patriotism, and spread rumors that the British would soon betray their own law. But word of his plan leaked. Bahamian dockworkers and fishermen carried warnings to the soldiers, and Governor Cockburn ordered Nassau's cannons aimed at the harbor. Any American ship attempting to board the Creole would face British fire. The standoff was set. One misstep, and 2 nations might be dragged into open conflict. On the deck of the Creole, Madison Washington stood with his comrades, watching the fog lift to reveal Nassau's shoreline. Freedom was close enough to touch, yet the threat of betrayal hovered in every shouted command, every loaded cannon, every whisper of diplomacy behind closed doors. Around him, the people he had freed clutched their children, gripped their makeshift weapons, and stared at the land that might finally accept them as human beings. The harbor had become a crucible where law, solidarity, and empire collided. And as the tide shifted, the former slaves of the Creole waited to learn if they had truly reached sanctuary, or if their hard-won liberty would be stripped away by the machinery of politics. The Creole sat moored in Nassau Harbor like a wounded beast, its timbers scarred, its decks haunted by the ghosts of the uprising. For days, tension hung over the brig like storm clouds that refused to break. The Bahamian people shouted encouragement from their small boats, soldiers of the West India Regiment kept guard, and British officials paced between the ship and the governor's offices. The fate of 135 men, women, and children balanced on the edge of law and politics. Madison Washington knew the moment of truth had come. British officials made it clear they would not force the rebels back into American hands, but there were risks, arrests for mutiny, charges of piracy, and the ever-present possibility that American influence might twist British resolve. Washington gathered his companions and then, with measured authority, addressed all those who had been freed. "You have a choice," he declared, his voice carrying over the deck. "Remain here, under the eyes of America's agents, or step onto this land where British law says no man can be a slave. The decision is yours. Freedom is before you, but you must claim it." The silence that followed was unbearable. For people who had been ordered every day of their lives when to eat, when to work, when to breathe, the burden of choice was both liberating and terrifying. Yet one by one, figures began to move. Mothers clutching infants, men leaning on one another for support, children wide-eyed with wonder. They descended the gangplank into the waiting boats of the Bahamians. With every step, chains of generations seemed to fall away. Tears and cries filled the air. Some kissed the planks beneath their feet before climbing down. Others gazed back at the ship, at the memories of terror and violence it held, and spat in contempt. The Bahamian rowers embraced them, ferried them ashore, and welcomed them with open arms. It was not the thunder of cannons nor the clash of swords that secured their liberty now, but the simple act of walking away from the vessel that had once defined their captivity. Yet not all chose to leave. 4 women and a single child remained aboard. Their reasons were shrouded in mystery, whispered only in fragments. Some believed they feared for family left behind in Virginia that to flee might doom their loved ones to vengeance. Others could not face the uncertainty of a new world in a strange land, their lives already broken by separation and grief. One woman, Rachel Glover, was said to have 3 children still enslaved. She could not bring herself to step onto free soil while her heart remained chained to theirs. Their choice cast a long, sorrowful shadow over the triumph of the others. As the last boat pulled away, the Creole was transformed from a slave ship into an empty shell, a floating monument to both brutality and defiance. Its deck, once crowded with chained bodies, now echoed only with the footsteps of sailors and soldiers. For those who disembarked, Nassau's shore was not just sand, it was the beginning of new lives. For those who stayed, it was the continuation of a nightmare. But victory was not without cost. 19 of the revolt's leaders, including Madison Washington, Elijah Morris, Doc Ruffin, and Ben Blacksmith, were arrested and marched through Nassau's streets to the town prison. The structure was built of stone, damp and suffocating, its underground chamber known among locals as the dungeon. The very men who had turned a slave ship into a battlefield now found themselves behind bars once more. Inside the prison's dark corridors, chains rattled anew. The irony was cruel, but the rebels bore it with grim resolve. They had not been captured by their enemies, but detained by their would-be protectors while the courts decided their fate. Would Britain declare them pirates, criminals who had committed murder on the high seas, or would it recognize them as men exercising the ultimate right, the right to fight for freedom? 2 rebels would not live to hear the verdict. One succumbed to wounds inflicted during the uprising, his body too frail to recover. Another fell to illness, worsened by the dungeon's filth and damp. Their deaths were quiet, unmarked by ceremony, yet they carried the same weight as those who had fallen on the Creole's deck. Sacrifices carved into the cost of liberty. Outside the prison walls, the Bahamian people did not forget. Crowds gathered, demanding justice not for the slave traders, but for the rebels. Their voices carried through Nassau's streets, a chorus of defiance against America's demands. The solidarity of the black population was unshakable. To them, Madison Washington and his companions were not criminals but heroes, men who had dared to seize freedom with their own hands. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic world, news of the Creole revolt spread like wildfire. American consuls fumed, Southern planters raged, British abolitionists celebrated, and governors weighed their words with trembling care. In parlors, taverns, and newspapers, people debated, were these men murderers or revolutionaries? Was there violence, savagery, or justice? In the damp dungeon of Nassau, Madison Washington waited, his eyes steady in the flickering torchlight. He had no illusions about the fragility of freedom. He had lived in Canada, only to be dragged back to Virginia. He had fought, killed, and bled to rise again. And now, he stood on the edge of history, not knowing whether the world would call him a pirate or a prophet. The Creole revolt was no longer a matter of chains and knives. It had become a question that would echo through courts, parliaments, and congresses. Could the fight for freedom be a crime? The walls of Nassau's dungeon held Madison Washington and his comrades in darkness, but outside those stone chambers the revolt was igniting a firestorm across 2 continents. From Washington, D.C. to London, from southern plantations to northern newspapers, The Creole had become more than a ship. It was a question that cut at the very heart of slavery, sovereignty, and law. In the American South, fury erupted like a wound torn open. To planters and traders, the revolt was not just a tragedy, but a nightmare realized. Enslaved men rising in arms, killing their masters, and walking free under the protection of a foreign flag. Politicians thundered in Congress that Britain had conspired to rob them of their property. Some newspapers called the event piracy, others painted it as terrorism. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina spat venom in debate, branding Britain's refusal to return the captives an outrage against civilization, and warning that it might justify war. But in the North, abolitionists seized the moment with equal force. Frederick Douglass declared that the revolt was proof that the enslaved would not remain docile forever, that liberty was an instinct no lash could kill. The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's fiery newspaper, hailed Madison Washington as a man who had done more in one night than Congress in a decade. Joshua Reed Giddings, an Ohio congressman, went further. He introduced resolutions declaring that once a slave left U.S. territorial waters, he ceased to be property. His bold stance brought swift censure by Congress, the second time in American history a member had been so punished. Yet when he returned home, he was re-elected in a landslide, a hero to a rising northern movement. The clash of applause and condemnation revealed a union stretched thin, its seams fraying under the strain of slavery's contradictions. In Washington, the responsibility for steering between outrage and war fell to Secretary of State Daniel Webster. A man of towering intellect but tangled loyalties, Webster carried not only America's diplomatic burden but also private ties. He had lucrative legal connections to Baring Brothers, the powerful British banking house. His counterpart across the table was none other than Lord Ashburton Alexander Baring himself. The irony was brutal. Two men with business ties negotiating the fate of men who had shed blood for freedom. Webster demanded compensation for the lost slaves, calling them property protected by American law. Ashburton refused, pointing to British policy that recognized no man as property once in free waters. Between them stretched a chasm of principle that neither treaties nor commerce could easily bridge. Yet both knew war was a possibility neither nation could afford. Border disputes in Maine, the memory of the Caroline Affair in 1837, and the fragile peace along the Canadian frontier all loomed like tinder waiting for a spark. The Creole could be that spark. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, the Creole's owners turned to another battlefield, the courts. Insurance policies had been taken out on the cargo, but companies balked at paying claims for slaves lost in rebellion. Lawsuits flooded the Louisiana Supreme Court. One young attorney named Judah P. Benjamin, destined to become Secretary of State of the Confederacy, argued fiercely for the insurers. His position was as chilling as it was pragmatic. Revolts were foreseeable risks, and the owners had been negligent in security. Therefore, no compensation should be owed. Coming from a man who himself owned more than 100 slaves, it was hypocrisy steeped in irony. In 1845, the court ruled in favor of the insurers, establishing a precedent that reverberated through Southern commerce. The rebellion of the enslaved was not an act of God, but a failure of the masters. The diplomatic ripple reached across the Atlantic as well. In London, abolitionists rallied, pointing to the Creole as vindication of Britain's moral leadership. Public meetings thundered with speeches celebrating the revolt as proof that human dignity could triumph even on the blood-soaked decks of a slaver. The British press contrasted the courage of Madison Washington with the barbarity of American laws that priced men like cattle. The case became a weapon in a broader campaign, one that embarrassed the United States on the world stage. Yet inside Nassau's prison, the rebels knew little of these debates. They endured damp walls, meager food, and the endless wait for trial. Each day blurred into the next, broken only by the flicker of lanterns and the occasional visit from British officers. Some rebels clung to hope that Britain would honor its laws. Others whispered fears that America's power might reach even into Bahamian courts. Madison Washington, calm as ever, told his companions that freedom was never secure until it was defended. "We won one battle," he said, "but the war is not yet over." Beyond the dungeon walls, Nassau itself became a stage. Bahamian crowds gathered outside government buildings, their voices demanding liberty for the rebels. For them, the case was not abstract diplomacy, it was kinship. Many had once been captives themselves, or were children of those freed by the Royal Navy. Their chants, their presence in the streets, made clear that if Britain faltered, it would face not only American anger, but its own people's wrath. The Creole had carried its captives into freedom, but in doing so, it had carried the United States and Britain into confrontation. For months after, letters flew, speeches thundered, threats sharpened. Would Britain yield to American demands, or stand firm on the law of abolition? Would America risk war to defend the ownership of men, women, and children? The questions hung heavy in both capitals, echoing louder than cannons. And in the damp cells of Nassau, Madison Washington and his fellow rebels waited to learn whether their defiance would be branded piracy or immortalized as the most successful revolt against American slavery. When April of 1842 arrived, the dungeon doors in Nassau finally swung open for judgment. The British Admiralty Court convened to decide the fate of Madison Washington and the 18 other men accused of mutiny, murder, and piracy. The stakes were enormous. A guilty verdict would vindicate America's demand for punishment. An acquittal would send tremors through every slave-holding household from Virginia to Louisiana. The judges listened as witnesses spoke: British soldiers, Bahamian civilians, even wounded crew. But the law was clear. Under British jurisdiction, slavery did not exist. These men had not mutinied against their lawful master, but resisted unlawful bondage. In April, the ruling came down with thunderous weight. The rebels were not pirates. They were men who had exercised their natural right to fight for freedom. 17 walked free. Madison Washington left the courtroom on the 16th of April, 1842, and vanished into the mists of history. Some whispered he remained in the Bahamas under another name, living quietly among the islands. Others claimed he slipped back into America, risking capture to ignite new rebellions. His fate remains a mystery, but his legend did not die. For abolitionists, he became a symbol of defiance, a ghost haunting the dreams of slaveholders. Elijah Morris, the youngest conspirator, chose permanence over anonymity. Settling in the Bahamian village of Gambier, he bought land, farmed, and raised a family. By 1879, he was a respected man, paying his taxes and securing deeds in his name, an act of ownership denied to him in Virginia. His descendants, carrying the Morris surname, live in the Bahamas to this day, the bloodline of rebellion quietly rooted in island soil. Doc Ruffin's skills found new purpose. Once forced to use his medical knowledge in the service of oppressors, he became a healer among the free communities of Nassau. He treated wounds not just of the body but of the mind, documenting scars, traumas, and the silent anguish of those who had survived the Creole. In time, some would come to see him as one of the first men to understand the psychological toll of slavery, an archivist of pain who refused to let the truth be buried. Ben Blacksmith disappeared almost completely. Rumors suggested he joined clandestine abolitionist networks, perhaps even helping enslaved men and women escape to British territory using his maritime expertise. To sympathetic ears, he was a phantom navigator, a figure whispered about in Caribbean ports, always unseen, always one step ahead, guiding others to freedom as he once guided the Creole. But the story was not only one of triumph. The 4 women and 1 child who remained on the Creole suffered a crueler fate. When the brig finally limped into New Orleans, they were seized and sold at auction. 1 woman died in childbirth just 2 years later. The child, his name lost to the ledger, was sold away and disappeared forever into the shadowed web of the domestic slave trade. Their stories stand as a stark reminder that even the most successful rebellion could not save everyone. There were rare glimmers of mercy. Lucy Cheatham, once enslaved by a trader who had fathered children with her, was eventually freed in his will. He left her and their children a fortune, an act of hypocrisy wrapped in sentiment. But for most who stayed behind, freedom was never offered, only sold and resold until death closed the ledger. The revolt's aftershocks reverberated through culture as well as politics. Frederick Douglass immortalized Madison Washington in The Heroic Slave, 1852, portraying him as a revolutionary whose courage rivaled that of America's founding fathers. Harriet Beecher Stowe referenced the Creole case in Uncle Tom's Cabin, amplifying it as part of the abolitionist arsenal. Solomon Northup, in 12 Years a Slave, nodded to the revolt, embedding it into the wider narrative of resistance. These works carried the story far beyond the Caribbean, transforming it from courtroom proceedings into myth and legend. Across the Atlantic, even Charles Dickens could not ignore the Creole. In his American Notes of 1842, he marveled at the fear gripping Southern planters, each of whom saw in their enslaved laborers the reflection of Madison Washington. Dickens mocked the hypocrisy of a republic proclaiming liberty while trembling before the very men it enslaved. To European readers, the case revealed America's deepest contradiction with brutal clarity. For the rebels who remained in the Bahamas, life was uneven. Some integrated into existing African communities, their names lost as they married, farmed, and raised families. Others struggled to adapt, haunted by trauma, distrustful of strangers, or marked forever by the blood they had shed, but their survival alone was victory. They had transformed from cargo into citizens, from property into people who could choose their destinies. In the end, the afterlives of the revolt reflected the spectrum of freedom itself: triumph, obscurity, tragedy, and myth. Madison Washington's name faded into uncertainty, but his act of defiance lived on, carried in books, whispered in songs, remembered by descendants. The Creole was not just a ship, it was a moment when history bent, when men and women carved freedom out of blood and storm. The Creole revolt did not vanish with the splash of chains into Nassau Harbor. Its echoes rolled outward, reshaping law, commerce, and memory in ways no one aboard that brig could have foreseen. Diplomatically, the crisis lingered like a festering wound. In 1853, more than a decade after the uprising, the case was submitted to an international arbitration commission in London. For 2 years, lawyers quarreled over documents and principles, until in 1855 the decision came: Great Britain would pay the United States £110,330 in compensation, about $20,000 per person in today's value. To Washington, it was a victory, proof that human property could still carry a price tag. To abolitionists, it was a disgrace, the ultimate insult that liberty could be weighed in gold. Ironically, the arbitrator who made the final ruling was an American working for Baring Brothers, the very banking house tied to Daniel Webster and Lord Ashburton. The circle of hypocrisy was complete. On the ground in America, the revolt changed behavior in quieter but darker ways. Slaveholders, terrified of another Creole, transformed their ships into floating prisons. Guard details doubled, weapons were stockpiled, and shackles grew more brutal, designed to cut flesh as well as restrain it. Iron bars were welded into new designs to prevent conspiracies. These measures worked. There would never again be a successful uprising on a U.S. coastal slaver, but they also revealed something deeper. Fear had colonized the hearts of the masters. Every man in chains became, in their imagination, another Madison Washington waiting for his chance. That fear rippled far beyond the sea. Charles Dickens, visiting America in 1842, described a South trembling at shadows. He mocked the republic that proclaimed, "All men are created equal," while guarding its own plantations like fortresses. For Europeans, the Creole revolt exposed the hypocrisy of American democracy more starkly than any speech. Culturally, the revolt became a touchstone for abolitionist writers. Douglas's The Heroic Slave transformed Madison Washington into a mythic figure, a man of destiny who embodied both the brutality of bondage and the nobility of resistance. Stowe wove the Creole into a broader indictment of slavery, while Solomon Northup referenced it in 12 Years a Slave. Through literature, the rebels ceased to be nameless men in a legal dispute and became symbols of human defiance. Yet the story had darker undercurrents. Reports later revealed that enslaved communities across the South had shared information through secret networks, songs, whispers, and coded messages about ships like the Comet, the Hermosa, and finally the Creole. These were not isolated miracles, but part of a hidden web of resistance that American planters never fully understood. Slaves knew which ports led to British waters, which storms had carried ships astray, which laws might save them. The Creole was not just an accident of history, but the product of knowledge carefully preserved under the lash. The legacy also lives in bloodlines and in earth. Archaeologists on a remote Bahamian island recently uncovered artifacts, tools, pottery, and stones etched with names matching Creole manifests. They point to a community of former captives who not only survived but thrived, building farms, raising families, and leaving behind evidence that freedom was not abstract but lived, cultivated, passed on. Some Bahamian families still bear the surnames of the rebels, their ancestors' defiance quietly embedded in their lineage. But the greatest legacy of the Creole Revolt is the question it forces us to confront: what is the price of freedom? For Madison Washington and his companions, it was measured in blood, theirs, their captors, and those caught between. They proved that liberty, once tasted, cannot be forgotten, and that oppression breeds not obedience but revolt. The revolt did not end slavery in America. That institution would stagger forward for 2 more decades, collapsing only in the fires of civil war. Yet the Creole carved a truth into history's ledger. Freedom is rarely granted by the powerful. It is seized by the desperate, defended by the courageous, and remembered by those who inherit its cost. On one night in November 1841, in the darkness of a rocking ship, 135 human beings chose to gamble everything rather than live as property. Their story is not one of easy heroism, but of survival, vengeance, and resolve. They remind us that liberty is never free. It comes at a price, and sometimes that price must be paid in blood. What do you think of the Creole Revolt? Was it justice, or simply desperation given teeth? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into the forgotten chapters of history.